He was a tech billionaire, the man who seemed to have everything, except the one thing he couldn't live without: his family. Years ago, societal expectations and his own ambition tore them apart. But now, Chris Harrington is back, desperate to reclaim the love he abandoned. As he reconnects with his son, Elijah, a bright-eyed boy who doesn't fully understand why his father disappeared, Chris faces the one person who's not ready to forgive him. Olivia, the woman who once loved him but has vowed never to let him hurt her or their son again. Can Chris prove he's changed? Or will the ghosts of his past destroy his second chance before it begins? What secrets still lurk behind their broken love story? And what will it take to bring this fractured family back together? One man's fight for redemption, one boy's dream of a united family, one woman's struggle to trust again. Will they rise above their past? Or will it all fall apart for good? The answers will leave you breathless. Can love truly conquer all? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The late afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Mark's Cathedral, casting a rainbow of colors across Olivia Thompson's ivory wedding gown. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her bouquet of white roses, but her chin remained high, her eyes bright with determination. Chris Harrington stood at the altar, his usually confident smile softening into something more vulnerable as he watched his bride approach. The cathedral's grand architecture seemed to amplify every whisper from the gathered crowd of Silicon Valley's elite. "A journalist?" someone murmured from the tech mogul section. "Well, she is quite accomplished," came another whispered response, the tone carrying a hint of surprise that suggested it shouldn't have been possible. Chris's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his eyes never left Olivia's face. As she reached him, he took her hand in his, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You look absolutely beautiful," he whispered, his voice carrying nothing but pure adoration. The ceremony proceeded with all the grandeur money could buy. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and the string quartet played flawlessly. Yet beneath the perfect surface, currents of tension swirled through the gathered crowd. At the reception, held in the city's most exclusive hotel ballroom, Olivia moved through the crowd with grace. Her background as a journalist served her well, as she navigated conversations with tech CEOs and their wives, answering their thinly veiled probing questions with poise. "And where did you attend school?" asked Mrs. Henderson, wife of a prominent venture capitalist, her diamond necklace glinting as she tilted her head. "Northwestern," Olivia replied smoothly. "I was editor of the college newspaper before starting my career at the Chronicle." "Oh, how interesting," Mrs. Henderson responded, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Chris appeared at that moment, sliding his arm around Olivia's waist. "My wife's latest investigative piece is up for a national award," he said proudly, emphasizing the word wife with obvious pleasure. Their honeymoon in the Maldives felt like a dream, just the two of them in a private villa over crystal-clear waters. They spent mornings walking on the beach, afternoons exploring coral reefs, and evenings watching the sunset from their deck. "I love you," Chris would say randomly, catching Olivia's hand as they walked along the shore. "You know that, right?" "I do," Olivia would respond, her smile bright and genuine. "And I love you too." But reality crashed back in during their first major social event as a married couple, the annual Tech Innovation Gala. Olivia wore a stunning red gown, her natural hair styled elegantly, while Chris looked sharp in his tuxedo. "Chris, my boy," called out Gerald Matthews, a senior board member of Chris's company. "Quite a change from your usual type, isn't it?" Chris's hand tightened around his champagne glass. "My wife is exceptional in every way, Gerald," he replied, his tone pleasant but firm. Olivia touched his arm gently. "Actually, Mr. Matthews, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the recent privacy legislation I covered in my latest article. Your company's stance was quite interesting." The older man blinked, caught off guard by her direct reference to his company's controversial policies. Chris watched with pride as Olivia led the conversation into a sophisticated discussion of tech ethics and corporate responsibility. Later that evening, they stood in their penthouse living room, the city lights twinkling below them like earthbound stars. Chris pulled Olivia close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You were amazing tonight," he said softly. "We were amazing," she corrected him, leaning into his embrace. "Together." Chris turned her to face him, his expression serious. "I promise you, Olivia, whatever comes our way, we'll face it together. Always." Olivia smiled up at him, her eyes reflecting both love and steel. "Together," she agreed, knowing they would need every ounce of their combined strength for the journey ahead. 2 years after their wedding, the grand ballroom of the San Francisco Tech Summit buzzed with anticipation. Chris Harrington stood at the podium, his presence commanding attention from every corner of the room. His latest innovation in artificial intelligence had captured headlines worldwide, and his keynote speech drew hundreds of eager listeners. "The future isn't just about technology," he declared, his voice carrying the same charisma that had first caught Olivia's attention years ago. "It's about revolutionizing how we live, work, and connect." Meanwhile, in their modernist hillside home, Olivia sat at her desk, surrounded by half-empty coffee cups and scattered notes. Her laptop screen displayed an article about sustainable farming practices. Not her words, but those she was ghostwriting for a corporate client. Her own byline hadn't appeared in print for months. She glanced at the framed Journalism Award nomination letter hanging on the wall, remembering the night she'd declined to attend the ceremony. Chris had a major product launch that evening, and he'd needed her there, smiling for the cameras, playing the role of the supportive wife. Just this once, he'd said, but once had turned into a pattern. The memories flooded back, their second anniversary dinner, where Chris's chair remained empty while he handled an emergency board meeting. The journalism fellowship she'd turned down because it would have meant 3 months away from Chris's important social obligations. Each sacrifice had seemed small at the time, but they had piled up like stones weighing down her dreams. "I can't keep doing this," Olivia had said during their last big fight, her voice tight with frustration. "I'm losing myself, Chris." He'd barely looked up from his phone. "You're being dramatic, Liv. Look at everything we have. The house, the lifestyle. Isn't this what success looks like?" "Your success," she'd corrected him, but he was already answering another email. At a recent tech industry gala, Olivia had overheard 2 of Chris's board members talking near the bar. "Shame about his wife," one had said, swirling his scotch. "She used to be quite the ambitious journalist, didn't she?" "Well, being Mrs. Harrington is practically a full-time job," the other had replied with a laugh. "Can't expect her to keep up with her little newspaper articles." Olivia had slipped away quietly, the words cutting deeper than she'd wanted to admit. That night, she'd stared at her reflection in their massive bathroom mirror, wondering when she'd started to fade into the background of her own life. Now, as evening settled over San Francisco, Olivia sat cross-legged on their king-sized bed, her laptop balanced on her knees. The blank document seemed to mock her as rain peppered the floor-to-ceiling windows. From Chris's home office down the hall, she could hear his voice, confident and animated, as he conducted yet another late-night video call. "We'll need to push forward with the launch," his voice carried through the walls. "Whatever it takes." Olivia's fingers hovered over the keyboard of her laptop, the cursor blinking steadily on the empty page of another article she would never get credit for writing. The sound of rain grew stronger, drumming against the windows like an urgent message she couldn't quite decode. The crystal ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton sparkled with wealth and influence. Chandeliers cast golden light over San Francisco's elite as they gathered for the annual Tech Innovation for Humanity Gala. Chris stood at the podium, his tailored tuxedo and winning smile perfectly crafted for the occasion. Olivia sat at their designated table, feeling like an outsider despite her elegant emerald gown. She watched as Chris delivered his speech about technology's role in social change, noting how his words drew admiring nods from the crowd. During the dinner that followed, Gregory Sterling, one of Chris's major investors, leaned across the table. His voice carried just enough for nearby guests to hear. "Chris, my boy, you've done wonders with the company, but don't you think it's time to consider your image more carefully? Some of our more traditional investors have concerns." The implication hung heavy in the air. Olivia's hand tightened around her water glass. "Greg, please," Chris said with an uncomfortable laugh. "Let's focus on the charity tonight." But Sterling pressed on, his words slick with false concern. "I'm just saying certain choices can impact market confidence. Your marriage, for instance." "That's enough," Olivia cut in, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. The drive home was silent. As soon as their front door closed, Olivia turned to Chris. "You just sat there," she said, her voice breaking. "You let him disrespect our marriage, and you just sat there." "What was I supposed to do?" Chris ran his hands through his hair. "Make a scene? These people control millions in investments. So their money matters more than your wife's dignity? Don't be naive, Olivia. This isn't about dignity, it's about business." "Everything is about business with you." Olivia's voice rose. "What happened to the man who promised to stand by me through anything?" "Maybe that man was naive too," Chris shouted back. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to maintain my position? Your constant insecurities are becoming a liability." The word liability hung between them like a blade. Over the next few weeks, their home became a battleground. Every conversation turned into an argument, every silence loaded with unspoken accusations. Chris spent more time at the office, where his board members and associates constantly reminded him of what was at stake. "The markets are watching, Chris," his CFO warned during a private meeting. "Your personal life is affecting share prices." "Think about your legacy," another board member advised. "Some sacrifices are necessary for greatness." At home, the distance between them grew wider. They moved through their mansion like ghosts, avoiding each other's paths. When they did interact, their words were sharp and wounded. One evening, Chris stood in his home office, staring out at the city lights. He made his decision with the same clinical precision he used for business deals. When Olivia came home, he was waiting in the living room. "This isn't working," he said simply. Olivia looked at him for a long moment, her face a mask of hurt and resignation. Without a word, she went upstairs and began packing a suitcase. An hour later, she walked down their curved staircase one last time. Chris stood by the window, watching her silhouette move through their manicured garden toward the gates. He told himself this was for the best, that she would be happier without the pressure of his world. Olivia's hands trembled as she unpacked boxes in her new apartment in Cedar Grove, a quiet town 3 hours from San Francisco. The modest two-bedroom space felt worlds away from the mansion she'd left behind. Sunlight streamed through bare windows, illuminating the scattered moving boxes labeled in her neat handwriting. As she reached for another box, a wave of nausea hit her. She'd been feeling off for weeks, attributing it to stress, but something felt different. In her bathroom, she stared at the pregnancy test's 2 pink lines, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Oh God," she whispered, sliding down to sit on the cold tile floor. Tears rolled down her cheeks, tears of fear, of hope, of overwhelming uncertainty. After hours of processing, Olivia made her decision. She wouldn't tell Chris. The thought of him choosing their child out of obligation, or worse, rejecting them both, was too painful to bear. Over the next few weeks, Olivia threw herself into building her new life. She set up a home office decorated with warm colors and peaceful artwork. Her laptop became her lifeline as she secured freelance writing contracts. Each morning she woke early, determined to prove she could do this alone. Meanwhile, in his San Francisco penthouse office, Chris sat surrounded by success but empty of joy. The city lights twinkled below, but he barely noticed them. Instead, his eyes fixed on a photo of Olivia from their honeymoon, her smile radiant as she looked at him over her shoulder on a Hawaiian beach. His fingers hovered over his phone, her number still memorized. But fear paralyzed him. What right did he have to disrupt her life again? The memory of their last fight echoed in his mind, along with all his failures to protect her from his world's cruelty. A particular memory haunted him, their first Christmas together, before everything fell apart. They had skipped his company's lavish holiday party to make cookies in their pajamas. Olivia had flour in her hair, and they'd laughed until their sides hurt. The simplicity of that joy now felt like a distant dream. In Cedar Grove, Olivia's neighbors gradually became friendly faces. Mrs. Chen from next door brought over homemade dumplings. The local bookstore owner, Dave, offered her a weekly column in the town paper. Small kindnesses that helped heal her heart. One evening, Chris stood in his empty mansion, surrounded by evidence of his success, awards, expensive art, news clippings of his achievements. None of it filled the void Olivia left behind. He picked up his phone again, composed a message, then deleted it. The pattern repeated nightly, his courage failing each time. Olivia stood on her small apartment balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft pinks and oranges. Her hand rested on her still flat stomach, protecting the secret growing within. The small town spread out before her, nothing like the glittering city she'd left behind. But here, she felt something she hadn't in years: hope. In his mansion across the city, Chris sat alone in his study, the photo of Olivia still in his hands. The weight of his choices pressed down on him like a physical thing, but he remained frozen in place, unable to bridge the gap he'd created. Olivia arrived in Cedar Grove with 2 suitcases and a laptop bag, her entire life condensed into these few belongings. The small town's main street, lined with maple trees and family-owned shops, offered a peaceful contrast to San Francisco's sleek skyscrapers. Her new apartment, though modest, felt warm and inviting with its creaky wooden floors and large windows that let in streams of natural light. She immediately set up her workspace, a simple desk facing the window, where she could watch the town come alive each morning. Between unpacking boxes and sending pitches to editors, Olivia tried to ignore the growing discomfort in her lower back. One evening, while working on an article, sharp pains caused her to double over. Her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Green, heard her gasp through the thin walls and rushed to check on her. The kind woman's weathered face creased with concern as she helped Olivia to her feet. "Let's get you to the hospital, dear," Mrs. Green said firmly, already reaching for her car keys. At Cedar Grove Community Hospital, Olivia gripped the bed rails through each contraction. Hours later, she heard her son's first cry, strong and defiant. When the nurses placed him in her arms, Olivia's breath caught in her throat. Elijah's eyes, bright blue like his father's, stared up at her with an intensity that made her heart ache. "It's just you and me, little one," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "And we're going to be just fine." The following months tested Olivia's strength and resilience. She wrote articles late at night while Elijah slept, often catching only a few hours of rest before he needed feeding again. Her breakthrough came with an investigative piece exposing financial fraud at a major tech company. The story went viral, bringing national attention to her work. But success came with its challenges. There were nights when Elijah wouldn't settle and deadlines loomed impossibly close. Mrs. Green proved invaluable during these times, offering to watch Elijah while Olivia conducted interviews or met with sources. Tom, the building's handyman, became another unexpected ally. He fixed the leaky faucet in her kitchen, installed better lighting in her home office, and always had a kind word to share. His practical support and cheerful presence helped make the apartment feel more like home. "You're doing great, Olivia," he'd say after finishing another repair. "That little boy of yours is lucky to have such a strong mama." As the months passed, Olivia found her rhythm. She learned to type with one hand while holding Elijah with the other, to conduct interviews during his nap times, and to appreciate the small victories of each day. The town's quiet charm and friendly faces gradually worked their way into her heart, healing old wounds she hadn't realized were still raw. One evening, as she sat by Elijah's crib watching him sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling peacefully, Olivia felt something shift inside her. The chaos and glamour of her previous life seemed distant now, replaced by the simple joy of watching her son grow and building a career on her own terms. Chris's morning routine was a symphony of luxury: Egyptian cotton sheets that felt like clouds against his skin, imported coffee from a small plantation in Colombia, and a view of the city that most people only saw in magazines. Yet as he stood in his penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the sunrise paint the skyline in gold and cast long shadows between the skyscrapers, he felt nothing but a gnawing emptiness that no amount of wealth could fill. His personal assistant rattled off his schedule through the sleek intercom system. Board meeting at 9, lunch with investors at noon, Tech conference keynote at 3, and the charity gala committee wants to confirm your attendance for next month." "Thank you, Sarah," he replied mechanically, his eyes fixed on a framed photo on his mahogany desk. It showed him and Olivia at a beach in Maui, both laughing as waves crashed behind them, her curls wild in the ocean breeze. Her smile in the picture made his chest tighten with an ache that had become all too familiar. The day passed in a blur of handshakes, PowerPoint presentations, and forced smiles. Chris closed a multi-billion-dollar deal that would reshape the tech landscape, earning enthusiastic congratulations from his executive team, but their praise felt hollow, like echoes in an empty room. That evening, he found himself at an upscale restaurant with Victoria, a model he'd been dating casually for the past few months. As she talked about her latest photo shoot in Milan, Chris's mind wandered to memories of quiet dinners with Olivia, where they'd discussed everything from politics to their dreams, her eyes sparkling with passion as she challenged his views. "Chris, are you listening?" Victoria's voice cut through his thoughts, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently on the white tablecloth. "I'm sorry," he said, loosening his tie slightly. "I'm not feeling well. Maybe we should call it a night." Back in his penthouse, Chris poured himself a drink, aged scotch that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and opened his laptop. Old photos filled his screen, Olivia at their wedding, radiant in her dress, during vacations where they'd explored hidden corners of the world, at home in simple moments, reading on their old couch with a cup of tea. Each image was a reminder of what he'd thrown away in his blind pursuit of success. The next morning, he called James, a mutual friend from their social circle, who had known them both since college. "Have you heard from Olivia lately?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual despite the desperation clawing at his throat. "Sorry, man, she dropped off the radar after, nobody's heard from her in months." Chris hired the best private investigators money could buy, sparing no expense. They searched social media, public records, professional databases, and even international travel logs. But Olivia had vanished completely, leaving no digital footprint for them to follow, as if she'd become a ghost in the modern world. "Mr. Harrington," one investigator reported, his voice apologetic over the phone, "it seems Ms. Thompson has deliberately covered her tracks. We've exhausted all conventional methods, and even some unconventional ones. She clearly doesn't want to be found." The failure hit Chris hard, like a physical blow to his chest. In his world of tech and innovation, there was always a solution, always a way forward, always another angle to try. But now, all his resources and connections meant nothing in the face of Olivia's determination to disappear. Memories flooded his mind, teaching Olivia to ski in Aspen, her infectious laughter when he fell more times than she did, quiet Sunday mornings reading the newspaper together, sharing sections and trading comments, the way she challenged his ideas and made him think differently about the world, opening his eyes to perspectives he'd never considered. Out on his balcony, Chris swirled the whiskey in his crystal glass, watching the amber liquid catch the city lights. The sprawling metropolis stretched before him, a glittering testament to his success, but it felt like a gilded cage of his own making. He whispered Olivia's name into the night air, the word carrying years of regret and longing into the darkness. The sweet aroma of vanilla and chocolate filled the small kitchen as Elijah stood on his step stool next to Olivia, his tiny hands covered in cookie dough. At 7 years old, his bright blue eyes sparkled with excitement as he helped shape the cookies into uneven circles, some looking more like clouds than proper rounds. The afternoon sunlight streamed through their kitchen window, casting warm shadows across the counter dusted with flour. "Mom, can we make extras for Mrs. Green?" Elijah asked, his tongue poking out in concentration as he worked the dough between his fingers. A small smudge of flour decorated his cheek. "Of course, sweetie. That's very thoughtful of you," Olivia replied, watching him with a mixture of love and quiet pain. Those eyes, so much like his father's, caught her off guard sometimes, especially in moments like these when her son's inherent kindness reminded her of earlier, happier times. "Tommy at school says his dad taught him how to throw a baseball," Elijah said casually, not looking up from his task as he pressed another misshapen cookie onto the baking sheet. "Did my dad like baseball?" Olivia's hand stilled for a moment before she reached for the cookie sheet, her throat tightening. "How about we add some extra chocolate chips to these ones? Mrs. Green loves chocolate," she deflected, reaching for the bag of chips with slightly trembling fingers. As Elijah grew, Olivia filled their evenings with stories of heroes and adventurers. She'd sit on the edge of his bed, telling tales of people who overcame great odds, her voice animated and warm in the soft glow of his bedside lamp. "And you see, even though Rosa Parks was scared, she knew what was right," she'd explain, watching his eyes grow wide with wonder, his small hands clutching his favorite blanket. But the Father's Day celebration at school proved particularly challenging. Elijah sat alone during the father-child activities, coloring quietly at his desk, while other kids played games with their dads in the classroom decorated with paper ties and cards. When Olivia picked him up that afternoon, his usual bounce was missing from his step, his small shoulders drooping under his backpack. "Everyone else had someone there," he whispered as they walked home, kicking at loose pebbles on the sidewalk. "Even Joey, whose parents are divorced, had his dad come." Olivia knelt down to his level, her heart breaking at the hurt in his voice. "Hey, look at me," she said softly, gently tilting his chin up. "Sometimes families look different, and that's okay. You and me, we're a team, the best team." Elijah nodded, but his eyes held questions she wasn't ready to answer. Later that week, during recess, he noticed how different he looked from his friends, his light blue eyes and fair skin contrasting with his brown complexion. The questions became more direct, more frequent, like persistent raindrops on a window. "Mom, why don't I look like you?" he asked one evening during dinner, pushing his peas around his plate. "And why don't I look exactly like the other kids either?" Olivia set down her fork, choosing her words carefully, her heart racing beneath her calm exterior. "Because you're uniquely you, honey. That's what makes you special," she said, reaching across to squeeze his small hand. But she saw the questions multiplying behind those familiar blue eyes, each one a reminder of the truth she kept hidden. At bedtime, Elijah showed her his latest drawing. Just the two of them, holding hands in front of their small house surrounded by carefully drawn flowers and a bright yellow sun. His smile was bright, but his eyes held an ocean of unspoken questions that Olivia wasn't sure how long she could avoid, questions that seemed to grow deeper and more complex with each passing day. Chris paced the crowded airport lounge, checking his watch for the 10th time in as many minutes. The announcement of his delayed flight had sent his carefully planned schedule into disarray. Around him, travelers rushed past, their rolling suitcases creating a constant background rumble that matched his growing irritation. He made his way to the coffee stand, ordered the strongest brew they had, and found an empty chair near the window. The bitter liquid did little to improve his mood. His mind, as it often did in quiet moments, drifted to thoughts of Olivia. The memories came uninvited. Her laugh, the way she'd scrunch her nose when reading, how she'd always known exactly what to say to calm him down in moments like these. The bustling airport faded into background noise as he lost himself in remembrance. A flash of movement caught his attention, something familiar in the way a woman walked past. Chris's heart stopped. There, not 20 feet away, stood Olivia. She looked different, yet exactly the same. Her hair was shorter now, but she still carried herself with that quiet confidence he remembered so well. But it was the small figure beside her that made his coffee cup nearly slip from his trembling hands. A boy, no more than 7 or 8, held tightly to Olivia's hand. Chris felt the air leave his lungs as he took in the child's features, those eyes so strikingly like his own, the familiar slope of his nose, the way he stood. There was no mistaking it. This was his son. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. The noise of the airport dimmed to a distant hum as Chris stared, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. His son. He had a son. The realization hit him like a physical blow, leaving him dizzy with shock and a strange mix of joy and regret. Chris gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning white as he debated what to do. Should he approach them? What right did he have to disrupt their lives? But how could he let them walk away, knowing he might never get another chance? His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, Chris stood on shaky legs. He took one step, then another, each movement feeling both terrifying and inevitable. When he was close enough, he gathered his courage and spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Olivia?" She froze mid-step, her entire body tensing at the sound of his voice. Slowly, she turned around, her expression shifting from confusion to shock as she registered who stood before her. The boy, his son, looked up at Chris with innocent curiosity, his blue eyes wide and questioning. "Olivia, it's been so long," Chris managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. Her grip on the boy's hand tightened visibly as she struggled to maintain her composure, her face a complex mixture of emotions he couldn't quite read. The bustling airport terminal seemed to narrow to a single point as Chris approached Olivia and Elijah. She was kneeling beside the boy, adjusting his backpack strap with gentle hands, her face animated as she spoke to him about their upcoming flight. Her fingers smoothed down his collar with that familiar tenderness that had once been directed at Chris, too. The sight made Chris's chest ache. This was the Olivia he remembered, full of warmth and care, the woman who could light up a room with just her presence. The moment she noticed him, that warmth vanished like sun behind storm clouds. Her body stiffened, and she rose slowly, pulling Elijah closer to her side with protective fingers curled around his shoulder. The boy looked up at Chris with innocent curiosity, his blue eyes, Chris's eyes, wide with interest, taking in every detail of the stranger before him. "Mom, who's that?" Elijah's small voice carried clearly despite the airport noise. He tugged at Olivia's hand, his gaze darting between the two adults, picking up on the crackling tension in the air. Chris took another step forward, his hands trembling slightly at his sides, his expensive suit feeling suddenly too tight around his throat. "Olivia, it's me." The words came out rough, barely above a whisper, weighted with years of regret. Olivia's glare could have frozen fire. She shifted her stance, placing herself between Chris and Elijah like a shield. Years of hurt and anger radiated from her in waves, making the space between them feel electric with tension. Her shoulders were squared, ready for battle. Chris attempted a smile at Elijah, but Olivia moved quickly to block his view, her movements sharp and decisive. "Stay back," she warned, her voice low but fierce. The mother bear protecting her cub, her dark eyes flashing with determination. The chaos of the airport seemed to fade into the background. The announcements over the PA system, the rolling suitcases, the chatter of hundreds of travelers. All of it dimmed compared to the intensity of this moment. Even the sunlight streaming through the terminal's massive windows seemed to hold its breath. "Can we talk, Olivia, please?" Chris's voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotion he was trying to contain. "I just need a moment." Olivia's jaw clenched as she stood there, clearly torn. Her protective instinct warred with something else in her expression. Perhaps the weight of all the words left unsaid between them, all the broken promises and shattered dreams. Elijah continued to look between them, his young face scrunched in confusion as he tried to understand the strange tension in the air, his small hand still gripping his mother's. "Not here," Olivia said sharply, turning away and guiding Elijah with her. They disappeared into the crowd, leaving Chris rooted to the spot, watching them go with a mixture of guilt and determination in his eyes. The echo of their footsteps seemed to mock him as they faded away, each step a reminder of how far he had to go to make things right. Chris hurried through the crowded terminal, his polished leather shoes clicking against the tile as he weaved between travelers and their luggage until he caught up with Olivia and Elijah near Gate B7. His heart pounded against his ribs like a desperate fist as he fell into step beside them, the familiar scent of Olivia's jasmine perfume hitting him with a rush of memories. "Where have you been all these years? How have you been?" The questions tumbled from his lips, his voice earnest and pleading, tinged with the desperation of a man who'd lost everything that mattered. Olivia kept walking, her spine straight and tense, designer handbag clutched tight against her side. "That's none of your business, Chris," she replied, her words clipped and cold as winter frost, each syllable precise and measured. Elijah pressed closer to his mother's side, his small fingers gripping the fabric of her wool coat like an anchor. His eyes, bright with curiosity and uncertainty, darted between the two adults, confusion plain on his young face as he tried to make sense of the crackling tension in the air. Chris's gaze shifted to the boy, taking in his features with growing intensity, his breath catching in his throat. He gestured toward Elijah with a trembling hand, his manicured fingers betraying his inner turmoil. "Who is he, Olivia?" "He's my son, that's all you need to know." Olivia's response was swift and firm, protective as a lioness, but Chris wasn't deterred. His eyes locked onto Elijah's familiar blue ones, the same shade he saw in the mirror every morning, the same color that ran through generations of Harringtons, the same sharp jawline, though softened by youth, the same curious tilt of the head that Chris's mother always said made him look like a thoughtful bird. Understanding crashed over him like a wave, leaving him breathless and unsteady on his feet. "Is he?" Chris couldn't finish the question, his voice breaking under the weight of possibility, of years lost and moments missed. Olivia said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes, filling the space between them with unspoken truths. The truth hung heavy in the air between them like storm clouds ready to break. "He's my son," Chris whispered, the words barely audible over the airport announcements echoing through the terminal and the steady hum of travelers. His face transformed from shock to wonder to crushing guilt in rapid succession, each emotion etching itself deeply into his features. Olivia's eyes flashed dangerously, sparking with years of buried hurt. "You have no right to claim him," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through steel. "You left us. You don't get to come back and pretend to care now." The words hit Chris like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy. But he couldn't tear his gaze away from Elijah, drinking in every detail of the son he never knew existed, the way his dark curls fell across his forehead, the slight dimple in his left cheek, the careful way he held himself. "Stay out of our lives, Chris," Olivia commanded, her voice steely with determination and years of protective instinct. She turned away, guiding Elijah through the crowd, with a gentle but firm hand on his shoulder. The boy glanced back over his shoulder at Chris, his blue eyes wide with questions and something that might have been longing, before disappearing into the sea of travelers with his mother, leaving Chris standing alone in the midst of strangers, his world forever altered. Chris found Olivia and Elijah in a quiet corner near an empty gate. His designer suit felt suffocating as he approached them, his steps measured and careful. Sweat beaded at his temples, and his Italian leather shoes clicked softly against the terminal's polished floor. "I just want to talk. Please," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years of regret. Olivia looked down at Elijah, who was playing with the zipper of his backpack, then back at Chris. Her shoulders tensed visibly, but after a long moment, she nodded and led them to a row of seats. Elijah settled between them, still focused on his backpack, his small fingers working the zipper back and forth in a steady rhythm. "You want to talk? Fine. Let me tell you what happened after you left," Olivia began, her voice low but intense. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face. "I found out I was pregnant while unpacking boxes in my new apartment. I was terrified and alone." Her hands twisted in her lap as she continued, her wedding ring long gone. "Do you know what it's like to work through morning sickness while trying to build a career from scratch? To go to doctor's appointments alone? To wonder if your child will face the same prejudices that tore their parents apart?" Tears welled in her eyes, but her voice remained steady, strong like steel wrapped in silk. "I worked 2 jobs while pregnant. After Elijah was born, I wrote articles at 3 a.m. while he slept, surviving on coffee and determination. Every milestone, every fever, every nightmare, I handled it all alone while you were out there living your perfect life." Chris leaned forward, his face etched with remorse, the lines around his mouth deeper than they'd been years ago. "I never meant to hurt you, Olivia. I thought I was doing what was best." "What was best?" Olivia cut him off, her voice sharp enough to make Elijah look up from his backpack, his small hands freezing mid-motion. "You thought abandoning us was what was best? Do you have any idea what that did to me? To us?" She took a deep breath, consciously lowering her voice as a passing traveler glanced their way. Every time someone asks Elijah about his father, every Father's Day at school, every time he notices he doesn't look exactly like me, that's your legacy, Chris. That's what you left behind. Chris reached out instinctively, his manicured hands trembling slightly. but Olivia pulled back as if his touch might burn. "Don't," she warned, wrapping her arms around herself protectively. "Don't think you can just walk into his life now. He doesn't need you, Chris. He has me, and I won't let you hurt him the way you hurt me." "Please," Chris begged, his voice breaking, all his corporate polish crumbling away. "I know I made a terrible mistake. Give me a chance to make it right." Olivia stood up, taking Elijah's hand in hers, their fingers intertwining automatically from years of practice. Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head, catching the light like diamonds. "No, Chris. You don't get to decide when to be a father." She turned away, leading Elijah through the terminal, her steps quick but steady. The boy looked back at Chris, his blue eyes wide with curiosity and something deeper, before following his mother into the crowd of travelers rushing to their destinations. Elijah fidgeted in the uncomfortable airport chair, his legs swinging back and forth as his eyes darted between his mother and the mysterious man sitting several rows away. The bustling terminal buzzed with activity, travelers rushing past with rolling suitcases, announcements echoing through the speakers, but his attention remained fixed on this puzzle before him. "Mom," he said, tugging at Olivia's sleeve with increasing urgency. "Who is that man? Why does he keep looking at us?" Olivia's fingers tightened around her phone until her knuckles whitened as she tried to maintain a neutral expression. Her jaw clenched slightly before she answered. "He's nobody, Elijah. Just someone I used to know." But Elijah wasn't satisfied. He studied the man's face with the intense focus only a curious child could muster, noticing how his eyes were the same shade of blue as his own, like a clear summer sky. Even the way the man's eyebrows furrowed in concentration matched what Elijah saw when he looked in the mirror each morning. "But Mom, he seems to know us and he looks kind of like—" "That's enough questions, sweetie." Olivia cut him off gently but firmly, her hand reaching out to smooth his curly hair. After a few minutes of tense silence, broken only by the constant hum of airport activity, Olivia's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and stood up, straightening her jacket. "I need to take this call, honey. Stay right here, okay? Don't move from this spot." As soon as Olivia walked toward a quieter corner of the terminal, her heels clicking against the tile floor, Elijah saw his chance. His heart racing with curiosity and a touch of defiance, he slipped from his seat and made his way toward Chris, who sat alone, staring at his hands as if they held answers to impossible questions. Chris looked up as Elijah approached, surprise and warmth flooding his face, making his eyes crinkle at the corners. Slowly, he crouched down to meet Elijah at eye level, his movements careful and gentle, like someone approaching a nervous deer. "Hi there," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's your name?" "I'm Elijah," the boy replied, standing tall as he studied Chris's face up close. "Why were you talking to my mom?" Chris swallowed hard, fighting back tears as he looked into eyes that mirrored his own, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "Your mom and we knew each other a long time ago." "Oh," Elijah said, tilting his head with childlike curiosity. "Before I was born?" Chris nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, before you were born." His hand twitched, as if fighting the urge to reach out and touch the boy's face. Before Elijah could ask another question, Olivia's voice cut through the air like ice. "Elijah!" She strode toward them, her face a mask of fury and protective fear. Grabbing Elijah's hand, she pulled him back with firm gentleness, positioning herself between him and Chris like a shield. "Stay away from him," she hissed at Chris, her eyes flashing with anger and fear, her whole body tense with maternal protectiveness. Chris sat in his dimly lit study, the city lights twinkling outside his window like distant stars. His fingers drummed restlessly on his mahogany desk as he replayed the airport encounter over and over in his mind. The image of Elijah's curious blue eyes, his eyes, haunted him, driving home everything he had missed. With determined focus, he opened his laptop and began composing an email to Olivia. He carefully chose each word, explaining his desire to provide financial support for Elijah's future. After reading it multiple times, he hit send, his heart pounding with hope. Miles away, Olivia's phone buzzed with the incoming message. Reading Chris's carefully crafted words, she let out a long, frustrated sigh before hitting delete. The next day, Chris arranged for the first package to be delivered, a collection of classic children's books he remembered loving at Elijah's age. When the doorbell rang, Elijah bounded to answer it, his face lighting up at the sight of the colorfully wrapped package. "Mom, look what came!" he exclaimed, tearing into the paper with childish enthusiasm. Olivia watched from the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her son's joy was infectious, but it didn't stop the knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. More packages followed: educational toys, art supplies, and finally, a shiny blue bicycle with Elijah's name custom painted on the frame. During a tense phone call, Olivia's voice was sharp as she addressed Chris. "You can't buy your way back into our lives." "That's not what I'm trying to do," Chris replied quietly. "I know I can't replace the time I lost. I just want to contribute something, anything, to his life." As weeks passed, Chris's approach shifted. Instead of expensive gifts, he began sending letters, simple, heartfelt messages sharing stories about his own childhood adventures, his travels, and gentle life lessons. Each envelope contained photographs of places he'd been, drawings he'd sketched, or small mementos that tied to his stories. Elijah began collecting these letters in a special box, often pulling them out to reread before bedtime. The personal nature of these messages touched something in him that even the finest toys couldn't reach. He started asking Olivia more questions about the mysterious man who wrote such interesting stories, but she remained cautious in her responses. One evening, Elijah sat cross-legged on the living room floor, reading Chris's latest letter aloud. Olivia listened from her armchair, her expression softening almost imperceptibly as Chris's words painted pictures of his own childhood fears and triumphs. Despite herself, she recognized the sincerity in his efforts, though her protective instincts remained firmly in place. The moonlight filtered through Olivia's living room window as she sat cross-legged on her couch, a weathered photo album open in her lap. Elijah's soft breathing could be heard from his bedroom down the hall, punctuated by the occasional rustle of bedsheets. Her fingers traced the edges of a photo from her wedding day, she and Chris dancing, their faces lit with pure joy. The memory of his cologne and the way he'd whispered, "I love you," against her ear that night came rushing back. Across town in his penthouse apartment, Chris held the same moment captured in a different frame. The city lights cast shadows across his face as he studied Olivia's radiant smile, remembering how it felt to hold her in his arms, how perfectly they'd fit together. Without thinking, he reached for his phone and typed out a message. "Can we meet for coffee just to talk?" His thumb hovered over the send button for a full minute before he finally pressed it. The message sat in Olivia's inbox for 2 days before she replied with a brief, "Okay." They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe tucked away from the bustling city center, a place they'd never been to together, neutral ground for both of them. When Olivia arrived, Chris was already there, fidgeting with a paper napkin that was slowly being shredded into tiny pieces. She slid into the seat across from him, her posture stiff and guarded, her handbag placed like a barrier between them. "You wanted to talk," she said simply, her voice carefully controlled. I do." Chris stumbled over his words, pushing aside the scattered napkin pieces. "I've been thinking about us, about everything that happened, about all the mistakes I made." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of the cafe's espresso machine, until Chris continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "I let other people's opinions matter more than they should have. I was scared of failing, of not being enough, and instead of facing those fears, I ran. I ran from the best thing that ever happened to me." Olivia wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, absorbing its warmth as if it could shield her from the vulnerability of this moment. "I wasn't perfect either," she admitted quietly, her thumb running along the cup's rim. "I kept so many things bottled up, expecting you to just know how I felt. When you missed our anniversary, I should have told you how much it hurt instead of just withdrawing." "I haven't been able to love anyone else," Chris confessed, his eyes meeting hers. "I've tried, but—" His voice trailed off, the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. "Me neither," Olivia whispered, surprising herself with her honesty. She quickly looked away, focusing on the steam rising from her cup, watching it spiral and disappear into the air. The admission hung between them, heavy with possibility. Chris leaned forward, hope evident in his expression, but Olivia straightened in her chair, her protective walls visibly rising again, like a shield she'd learned to deploy instinctively. "This doesn't change anything," she said firmly, though her tone lacked its usual edge. "Elijah comes first now. I can't risk him getting hurt." Her voice softened slightly at the mention of their son's name. As she stood to leave, the ghost of a smile played at the corners of her mouth. Chris remained seated, watching her walk away, his hands clasped tightly together on the table. For the first time in years, he felt that maybe, just maybe, not all was lost. The door chimed as she left, and the scent of her perfume lingered, a reminder of what once was and what might still be. Elijah sat at the kitchen table, pushing his cereal around with his spoon. His blue eyes, so much like Chris's, fixed intently on Olivia as she prepared her morning coffee. "Mom," he started, his voice careful but determined. "Why wasn't he there before? Why is he sending me letters now?" Olivia's hand stilled on the coffee pot. She'd been dreading these questions, knowing they were inevitable but still feeling unprepared. Taking a deep breath, she turned to face her son. "It's complicated, sweetie," she began, but Elijah's expression showed he wasn't satisfied with that answer. "But why?" he pressed. "Other kids have their dads around all the time." Olivia sat down across from him, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug. The morning sunlight streamed through their kitchen window, highlighting the serious expression on her son's young face. "Did he hurt you, Mom?" Elijah asked quietly, his voice small but direct. Olivia felt her throat tighten. She studied her son's face, seeing both innocence and understanding there. After a moment, she spoke carefully. "He made some mistakes that hurt me, yes, but people can change, and sometimes they deserve a chance to show it." As the days passed, Elijah's curiosity only grew stronger. During their weekly video calls with Chris, Elijah began asking direct questions, catching both adults off guard. "Why didn't you write to me before?" he asked Chris one evening, his face serious on the computer screen. Chris glanced at Olivia, who stood just out of frame before answering. "Well, I was traveling a lot for work," he said, keeping his tone light. "I remember this one time in Japan. I saw these amazing paper cranes." He smoothly transitioned into a story about his travels, careful to avoid the deeper truth. Olivia watched these interactions with a mixture of anxiety and reluctant appreciation. She noticed how Chris never undermined her role, how he deflected Elijah's harder questions with stories rather than excuses. Still, she couldn't help feeling tense during these conversations, afraid that one wrong word might shatter the delicate balance they'd achieved. During one video call, Elijah asked Chris about his favorite childhood memories. Olivia observed how Chris shared simple, genuine stories about building tree houses and learning to ride a bike, never trying to paint himself as more than he was. Later that evening, as Olivia tucked Elijah into bed, he looked up at her with those piercing blue eyes. "Do you think he'll stay this time?" he asked softly. Olivia stood there, the weight of the question hanging in the air between them, her silence filled with years of complicated emotions she couldn't yet put into words. Chris stood nervously outside the Science Museum, checking his watch for the third time and shifting his weight from foot to foot. When Olivia's silver sedan pulled up to the curb, his heart raced like a teenager's on his first date. Elijah bounded out, his blue eyes sparkling with excitement, his backpack bouncing against his shoulder. "Hi, Chris." Elijah waved enthusiastically, nearly tripping over his untied shoelace in his eagerness. Olivia emerged more slowly, her expression guarded behind her designer sunglasses, her shoulders tense beneath her cream blazer. Inside the museum's gleaming lobby, Chris and Elijah found themselves immediately drawn to the robotics exhibit. Chris watched in amazement as Elijah expertly manipulated a robotic arm to pick up small objects, showing a natural talent that made pride swell in his chest. "Did you know?" Chris said, leaning in conspiratorially. That similar robots are used in real factories? They help build everything from cars to smartphones. Elijah's eyes widened like saucers. Really? Can we see one someday? A real factory? Maybe, Chris replied carefully, glancing at Olivia, who stood a few feet away, pretending to read a display about artificial intelligence. She gave a slight nod, her face unreadable behind the mask of polite distance she'd perfected over the years. At the interactive physics display, they launched paper airplanes together, testing different designs and comparing flight patterns. Chris couldn't help but smile at Elijah's methodical approach, the way he adjusted each fold with precision, the careful way he documented results in a small notebook, reminding him so much of himself at that age. Later, at a small retro diner nearby, they shared juicy hamburgers and thick chocolate milkshakes served in tall glasses with whipped cream on top. Elijah enthusiastically described his latest school project, a model solar system complete with hand-painted planets and orbital paths. "I'm building one too," Chris exclaimed, wiping a spot of ketchup from his chin. "Well, it's actually a digital model for a presentation at work, but—" "Can I see it?" Elijah interrupted, practically bouncing in his seat, his half-eaten burger forgotten. "Does it show the moons too?" As they discussed various models and inventions, Chris felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling of rightness he'd never known he was missing. Yet beneath his joy lurked a nagging doubt, persistent as a shadow. Was he doing enough? Would he ever make up for lost time, for all the birthdays and school plays he'd missed? Olivia watched from her corner table, her coffee growing cold in its ceramic mug. She couldn't deny the natural rapport between father and son, how easily they fell into conversation about technology and science, finishing each other's sentences like they'd known each other forever. Still, years of hurt made trust difficult, like trying to rebuild a bridge while standing on its broken pieces. "And then," Elijah was saying, his words tumbling out in excitement, "I thought maybe we could build a robot together sometime, like a real one that moves." Chris swallowed hard, fighting back emotion that threatened to crack his voice. "I'd like that," he managed, his throat tight. "If your mom agrees." The afternoon passed quickly, filled with shared discoveries and tentative connections, precious moments strung together like pearls. When it was time to leave, Elijah surprised everyone by throwing his arms around Chris's waist in a tight hug that spoke volumes. Chris froze for a moment, then gently returned the embrace, his eyes meeting Olivia's over Elijah's head. His gaze held a silent plea for trust, for acceptance, for a chance to be the father he should have been all along. Olivia stood motionless, her carefully constructed walls showing the first signs of cracking, like ice beginning to thaw in the spring. Chris sat in his dimly lit office, his fingers hovering over his laptop's keyboard as he scrolled through years of old emails. Each message was like a piece of evidence, documenting the subtle manipulation that had led him to abandon Olivia. One particular email from Marcus Chen, his former board member, caught his attention. "Think about your legacy, Chris. Some relationships aren't worth the risk to your reputation." The words made his stomach turn. How had he been so blind? He clicked through photos from corporate galas and board meetings, seeing clearly now the calculated smiles and veiled prejudices that had surrounded him. His jaw clenched as he remembered the friendly advice and concerned suggestions that had poisoned his mind against his own happiness. With determined fingers, Chris drafted an email requesting an urgent meeting with his senior advisors, the same people who had once convinced him to choose status over love. Within hours, they gathered in the sleek conference room overlooking the city. "I've called you here today," Chris began, his voice steady and firm, "because we need to address the elephant in the room, specifically the role you all played in my separation from Olivia." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. "Chris, we only had your best interests at heart. It was professional advice." "Professional advice?" Chris cut him off, his voice sharp. "No, it was prejudice wrapped in corporate speak. You manipulated me into believing I had to choose between success and love." Over the next hour, Chris methodically laid out his accusations, watching his colleagues' faces shift from defensive to uncomfortable as he quoted their past conversations back to them. When they tried to justify their actions as business decisions, Chris stood firm. "I'm making changes," he announced, "starting with the people I surround myself with and the values this company represents." Over the following weeks, Chris initiated a complete overhaul of his professional life. He severed ties with toxic board members, restructured his leadership team to include diverse voices, and launched new initiatives focused on social responsibility. His company began partnering with organizations that promoted equality and inclusion in the tech sector. The transformation wasn't just professional. Chris cleaned house in his personal life too, distancing himself from the social circles that had once encouraged his worst instincts. He declined invitations to exclusive clubs and redirected his social calendar toward meaningful community engagement. Standing on his penthouse balcony that evening, Chris watched the city lights flicker below. The weight of societal expectations that had burdened him for so long felt lighter now. For the first time in years, he felt truly aligned with his values, ready to rebuild his life on a foundation of authenticity rather than appearance. Olivia sat in her living room watching Elijah's face light up as he played with the model rocket kit Chris had sent. Her son's fingers moved carefully over the pieces, his blue eyes focused with an intensity that reminded her so much of his father. The sight stirred conflicting emotions in her chest, pride in her son's joy, but also a gnawing uncertainty about the walls she'd built to protect them both. Reaching for her phone, Olivia hesitated for just a moment before dialing Chloe's number. Her best friend answered on the second ring, her warm voice immediately putting Olivia at ease. "Can we meet for coffee?" Olivia asked. "I really need your advice." An hour later, Olivia sat across from Chloe in their favorite cafe, wrapping her hands around a steaming mug of chai tea. The familiar scent of coffee and freshly baked pastries filled the air as afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows. "He's really trying, Chloe," Olivia admitted, her voice soft. "The gifts for Elijah, the letters, they're not flashy or expensive. They're thoughtful, personal." She paused, stirring her tea. "And you should see how Elijah lights up when he's around Chris. It's like he's finally found a missing piece of himself." Chloe listened intently, her dark eyes warm with understanding. "And how do you feel about all this?" "Scared," Olivia confessed. "Terrified, actually. What if I let my guard down and he hurts us again? I've worked so hard to build this life for Elijah and me." "You have," Chloe agreed, reaching across the table to squeeze Olivia's hand. "You've created something beautiful here. But Liv, maybe that's exactly why you're strong enough now to consider forgiveness. Not for Chris's sake, for yours and Elijah's." "What do you mean?" "I see how happy Elijah is when he talks about Chris, having both parents in his life. That's something special." Chloe's voice was gentle but firm. "You don't have to rush into anything, but don't close the door entirely. Let him prove himself." Olivia looked down at her tea, letting Chloe's words sink in. "I'm not sure I know how to trust him again." "Maybe start small," Chloe suggested. "You've already seen him making consistent efforts. Watch his actions, not just his words." After their talk, Olivia walked home slowly, her mind swirling with thoughts. Through the living room window, she could see Elijah sitting cross-legged on the floor, reading one of Chris's letters. His face broke into a wide smile as he turned the page, and Olivia felt something shift in her heart. Maybe, just maybe, giving Chris another chance would be worth the risk. Chris paced around his kitchen, checking the oven for the third time in 10 minutes. The aroma of roasting chicken and fresh herbs filled the air as he adjusted the place settings one more time, making sure everything was perfect. His hands trembled slightly as he straightened the silverware, and he found himself obsessively aligning the fork tines, knowing this dinner could be a turning point in rebuilding his family. The doorbell rang, sending his heart racing. Chris took a deep breath, smoothed his crisp blue shirt, and opened the door to find Olivia and Elijah standing there. Elijah's eyes widened at the sight of the grand foyer, its high ceilings, crystal chandelier, and elegant decor capturing his attention immediately. "Can I look around?" Elijah asked excitedly, bouncing on his toes, his sneakers lighting up with each hop. Chris smiled warmly, his heart swelling at his son's enthusiasm. "Of course, buddy. Just be careful with the sculptures in the study. They're a bit fragile." As Elijah darted off to explore, his footsteps echoing through the house, Olivia stepped inside, her eyes taking in the familiar surroundings. The house hadn't changed much since she'd last been there, though some of her personal touches were noticeably absent. The family photos, her collection of vintage books, the throw blanket she'd always kept on the living room couch. "Would you like something to drink?" Chris offered, leading her to the kitchen. "I remember you used to love my homemade lemonade. I made a fresh batch this morning." "That would be nice," Olivia replied, her voice soft but guarded, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her purse. Over dinner, Chris shared stories from their early days together, careful to choose lighter moments that wouldn't stir up painful memories. The candlelight cast a warm glow across their faces as he spoke. "Remember that time we got lost hiking and ended up at that tiny diner in the middle of nowhere?" A genuine smile crossed Olivia's face, bringing back some of her old radiance. "The one with the amazing apple pie? Where we had to wait out that thunderstorm? And the waitress who kept calling us honey and sugar," Chris added, causing Elijah to giggle and nearly spill his water. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere grew warmer, more relaxed. Laughter echoed through rooms that had been silent for too long. Chris watched Olivia's shoulders gradually lose their tension, her smiles coming more easily, her eyes sparkling like they used to when they first fell in love. During a quiet moment, Chris looked around the table at their faces illuminated by candlelight, taking in every detail of this precious moment. "This is the first time in a long time this house has felt like a home," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, fingers gripping his napkin tightly. Olivia's eyes met his, something shifting in her expression, a mixture of nostalgia and cautious hope. Before she could respond, Elijah spoke up eagerly, pushing his empty plate aside. "I wish we could be like this all the time. You know, a real family." The words hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Olivia's hand tightened around her water glass, her expression careful as she absorbed their son's words. Though she remained silent, the slight softening around her eyes and the gentle way she reached out to smooth Elijah's hair suggested she wasn't entirely opposed to the idea. The kitchen clock ticked softly in the background, marking this moment of potential change. The headlines splashed across tabloids and news websites like wildfire: "Tech billionaire's secret love child discovered," and "Chris Harrington's hidden family revealed." Paparazzi descended on the quiet town, their cameras clicking incessantly as they stalked the streets near Olivia's home. News vans lined the once peaceful neighborhood, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Olivia's hands shook as she dialed Chris's number, her coffee growing cold beside her on the kitchen counter. "Have you seen the headlines?" she demanded, her voice tight with anger and fear. "They're saying horrible things, Chris. They're questioning whether Elijah is really yours, suggesting I planned this whole thing for money. They're even digging into my past, trying to paint me as some kind of gold digger." "I'm so sorry, Olivia," Chris replied, his voice firm and determined. "I'll handle this, I promise you. They have no right to spread these lies about our family. My PR team is already working on it." Chris wasted no time organizing a press conference. Standing at the podium in a crisp navy suit, his expression resolute, he addressed the sea of reporters and flashing cameras. The room buzzed with whispered speculation and the soft whir of camera equipment. "I want to address the recent speculation about my personal life," he began, his voice unwavering. "Yes, I have a son. His name is Elijah, and he is the greatest gift I never deserved. Olivia Thompson is his mother, and she has done an incredible job raising him on her own while I was absent due to my own mistakes. The blame for that lies entirely with me." His eyes hardened as he continued, gripping the edges of the podium. "Olivia is one of the strongest people I know, and I will not tolerate any insinuation that questions her integrity. Any publication that continues to spread malicious rumors about her or our son will face legal consequences. I have the resources to defend my family, and I will use them." While some media outlets praised Chris's candid admission and defense of his family, others doubled down on their speculation. The attention began to affect Elijah at school, where children repeated snippets of conversations they'd overheard from their parents. The whispers followed him through the hallways like unwanted shadows. "Is it true your dad's a billionaire?" one classmate asked during lunch, leaning across the cafeteria table. "My mom says your mom trapped him," another whispered from behind his hand. The words stung like tiny arrows, each one finding its mark in Elijah's heart. That evening, Elijah sat on the couch beside Olivia, his small shoulders slumped, his favorite superhero backpack abandoned by the door. "I don't like all these cameras and questions," he confessed, his voice trembling. "Why can't we just be normal? Tommy won't even sit with me at lunch anymore." Olivia pulled him close, her heart breaking as she felt his tears dampen her shirt. She stroked his hair, trying to find the right words to comfort him while struggling with her own anxiety about the situation. The weight of protecting him from this media storm felt almost impossible to bear. Later that evening, Chris arrived at their home, having navigated through the crowd of photographers outside. His face was etched with concern as he entered the living room, his tie loosened and jacket wrinkled from a long day of damage control. "No matter what happens," he promised, looking at both Olivia and Elijah, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here for you. We'll get through this together." Elijah managed a small, hesitant smile while Olivia nodded, her jaw set with determination to protect their newfound family unit, fragile as it might be. The three of them sat together in the growing darkness, finding strength in their unity against the chaos swirling outside their doors. Chris sat in the polished leather chair of his lawyer's office, his fingers drumming nervously on the mahogany desk. The idea of a paternity test had been weighing on his mind for days. While he had no doubts about Elijah being his son, the boy's striking blue eyes and mannerisms were unmistakably his own. He knew that scientific proof could silence the relentless media speculation. With a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and dialed Olivia's number. Her voice was tense when she answered, already anticipating more complications. "I think we should consider getting a paternity test," Chris said carefully, bracing himself for her reaction. "What?" Olivia's voice crackled with anger through the phone. "Elijah doesn't need a test to know who his father is. How dare you even suggest that?" Chris leaned forward in his chair, his voice gentle but firm. "This isn't about us, Olivia. It's about protecting Elijah. You've seen how the rumors are affecting him at school. If we can put this matter to rest definitively, it might make things easier for him." Silence filled the line as Olivia processed his words. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke again, her voice softer. "Let me think about it." The next morning, Olivia called back. "Okay," she said quietly. "For Elijah's sake, we'll do it." At the private clinic, Chris and Elijah sat side by side in the sterile examination room. Elijah swung his legs back and forth, fascinated by the medical equipment around him. He seemed to view the whole experience as an adventure, unaware of its deeper implications. "Why are we here, Dad?" Elijah asked, his eyes bright with curiosity. Chris ruffled Elijah's hair affectionately. "This is just to prove to the world what we already know, buddy. Nothing more than that." The procedure was quick and painless, just a simple cheek swab for both of them. When the results arrived a few days later, they confirmed what Chris had known in his heart. Elijah was undeniably his son. Chris organized another press conference, standing tall at the podium as cameras flashed. "Today, I'm here to put an end to the speculation about my son," he announced, his voice strong and clear. "The DNA results confirm what I've known since the moment I saw him. Elijah is my son. I am incredibly proud to be his father, and I will continue to be present in his life, supporting both him and his mother." The media response was immediate and mixed. Some outlets praised Chris's transparency, while others questioned his timing and motives. Through it all, Chris remained focused on what mattered most: his family. That evening, as Olivia tucked Elijah into bed, he looked up at her with hopeful eyes. "Does this mean Dad's going to be around more?" he asked. Olivia hugged him tightly, her heart full of conflicting emotions. "We'll see, sweetheart," she whispered, holding him close. Chris sat at the kitchen table with Elijah, surrounded by cardboard, wires, and batteries. They were working on Elijah's science project, a simple electric motor that had quickly evolved into an elaborate demonstration of electromagnetic principles thanks to Chris's engineering expertise. "And if we wrap the copper wire like this," Chris explained, demonstrating the technique. The magnetic field becomes stronger. Elijah's eyes lit up with fascination, but his excitement was interrupted by a sudden coughing fit. Chris patted his back gently, but the coughing didn't subside. Within minutes, Elijah's face had grown flushed and his forehead felt hot to the touch. "Hey buddy, you feeling okay?" Chris asked, worry creeping into his voice. Elijah shook his head, another coughing spell racking his small frame. Chris's hand flew to his phone, dialing Olivia's number while keeping a steadying hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Olivia, something's wrong with Elijah. He's burning up and can't stop coughing. I'm taking him to the hospital." They met at the emergency room entrance, Olivia's face tight with concern. The three sat in the sterile waiting room, the tension between the adults thick enough to cut with a knife. Every time Elijah coughed, both parents flinched, their shared worry momentarily bridging the gap between them. The diagnosis came after several tense hours, a severe respiratory infection requiring overnight observation. In Elijah's hospital room, Chris pulled up a chair beside the bed, holding his son's hand and sharing stories about his own childhood adventures. "Did I ever tell you about the time I tried to build a robot out of my mom's kitchen appliances?" Chris asked, earning a weak smile from Elijah. From her corner of the room, Olivia watched silently. She observed how Chris never let go of Elijah's hand, how he adjusted the blankets when Elijah shivered, how he kept their son distracted from the IV in his arm with endless stories and gentle jokes. It was a side of Chris she hadn't seen since their early days together. Patient, nurturing, completely present in the moment. When Elijah finally drifted off to sleep, Chris and Olivia stepped into the quiet hallway. Chris leaned against the wall, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "I've never been so scared in my life," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to lose him, Olivia. I don't want to lose either of you." Olivia crossed her arms, fighting the urge to comfort him. Years of built-up defenses didn't crumble easily, but watching him with Elijah had stirred something in her heart. "Thank you for staying," she said softly, her voice gentler than it had been in years. Chris looked at her, his eyes filled with determination and vulnerability. "I'll always be here for him. For both of you." The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Chris and Olivia sat at a corner table in the quiet cafe. Sunlight filtered through the large windows, casting warm patterns on their table, dancing across the worn wooden surface like gentle flames. Chris wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, his knuckles white with tension, the steam rising between them like an ethereal barrier. "Thank you for meeting me," he said softly, his usual confidence notably absent, replaced by a vulnerability she hadn't seen in years. "There's something I need to tell you." Olivia stirred her tea, her expression guarded but attentive, the silver spoon making gentle circles in the amber liquid. "What is it, Chris?" He took a deep breath, his shoulders tense beneath his well-tailored jacket. "I've been going to therapy for a while now. I needed to understand why I made the choices I did, why I hurt you." Olivia's spoon clinked against her cup as she set it down, surprise flickering across her face like a shadow passing over water. Chris continued, his voice growing unsteady, each word carrying the weight of years of regret. "I've been working through a lot of things. My insecurities, my fear of failure, this constant need to control everything." He paused, running a hand through his hair, the silver at his temples catching the sunlight. "And most importantly, this deep-seated belief that I wasn't good enough for you or Elijah." The cafe's quiet murmur filled the silence between them, as Chris gathered his thoughts, the distant sound of cups clinking, and quiet conversations creating a gentle backdrop to their moment of truth. "These fears, they drove me to make the worst decisions of my life. Walking away from you, from us. It wasn't about you. It was about me not being strong enough to face my own demons." Olivia listened intently, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup, her wedding ring long absent but the phantom weight of it still present in moments like these. Her expression softened slightly, though caution remained in her eyes like a guard unwilling to completely lower their shield. "I know I've hurt you in ways I can never take back," Chris said, his voice thick with emotion, his eyes glistening in the afternoon light. "But I want you to know I'm trying, really trying, to be better. For Elijah. And for you, if you'll let me." Olivia sat back in her chair, processing his words, her journalist's mind working to separate truth from hope. When she spoke, her voice was measured but gentle, like someone handling something fragile. "It's not just about you trying, Chris. It's about whether I can trust you again. Whether Elijah can." Chris nodded, understanding the weight of her words, feeling them settle on his shoulders like a familiar burden. "I know," he said quietly. "I appreciate your honesty, Chris," Olivia said, standing up, smoothing her skirt with practiced grace. "But actions speak louder than words." Chris nodded again, watching her gather her things, memorizing the determined set of her shoulders, the careful way she avoided his gaze. He remained silent, knowing that this time his actions would need to do the talking, and hoping that somehow they would be enough to bridge the chasm between them. The dusty attic creaked under Elijah's feet as he explored the forgotten space above their home. Sunbeams filtered through a small window, illuminating dancing dust particles and casting long shadows across stacked boxes and old furniture. The musty scent of aged wood and memories filled his nostrils as his curious eyes landed on a leather-bound album tucked between two cardboard boxes, its spine barely visible in the dim light. Pulling it free, Elijah brushed off the dust and opened it carefully, the leather crackling softly beneath his fingertips. His eyes widened at the sight of his parents, younger and radiantly happy, dressed in wedding attire. The photograph seemed to glow with joy and promise. He quickly gathered the album and descended the attic stairs, his heart racing with excitement. "Mom!" he called out, finding Olivia in the kitchen. "Look what I found!" Olivia turned from the dishes she was washing, her hands dripping soap suds onto the tile floor. Her breath caught when she saw the familiar album in Elijah's hands, and memories flooded back like a tidal wave. She dried her hands slowly on a nearby dish towel, buying time to steady her emotions. "What was it like, Mom?" Elijah asked, pointing to a photo of Olivia in her wedding dress, her smile radiant and eyes sparkling with joy. "When you and Dad got married?" Olivia sat down at the kitchen table, patting the chair beside her. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, warming her shoulders as Elijah settled next to her, and she began turning the pages slowly. "It was a beautiful day," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. The ceremony was held at this grand venue overlooking the city. The sunset that evening painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. Her fingers traced the edges of a photo showing her and Chris during their first dance, their bodies close and eyes locked on each other. "Your father was so nervous he kept stepping on my dress during practice," she chuckled, the memory bringing unexpected warmth to her chest. "But when the actual moment came, he danced perfectly, like we'd been dancing together our whole lives." Elijah leaned closer, studying each photograph intently, his face a mirror of his father's. "You both look so happy." "We were," Olivia admitted, her voice carrying a hint of nostalgia and something deeper, more painful. "We had all these dreams, traveling the world, building a life together, having a family." Her eyes grew distant as she remembered their early days, filled with possibility and promise. "Your father used to surprise me with picnics in the park. He'd pack these elaborate meals and tell me stories about the future he imagined for us. Sometimes we'd stay there until the stars came out." She turned another page, revealing photos of their honeymoon, the two of them laughing on a beach, exploring ancient ruins, holding hands against stunning sunsets. "We were young and in love, convinced we could conquer any challenge that came our way. Everything seemed possible then." Elijah watched his mother's face carefully, noting the mix of joy and sadness in her expression, the slight trembling of her lower lip. "You really loved him, didn't you?" he asked quietly, his young voice filled with understanding beyond his years. Olivia paused, her hand hovering over a photo of Chris kissing her cheek, their happiness frozen in time. The truth rose to her lips before she could stop it, carried on a wave of memories. "Yes, I did," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "And a part of me always will." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken emotions and years of complicated feelings. Elijah wrapped his arms around his mother in a tight hug, offering comfort in the way only children can. "Maybe we can all be happy together again someday?" Olivia held her son close, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo, her heart conflicted as she whispered, "Maybe." The word carried both hope and fear, possibility and pain, as the afternoon sun continued to warm the kitchen around them. Chris stood at the polished podium in the boardroom, his fingers gripping its edges until his knuckles whitened as camera flashes lit up the room. The gathered journalists and executives leaned forward in their seats, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief as he made his announcement. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "After careful consideration, I've decided to retire from my position as CEO," Chris said, his voice steady despite the murmurs that rippled through the crowd like waves on a pond. "It's time for me to focus on what truly matters, my family." His words hung in the air, weighted with years of regret and newfound determination. Questions erupted from the journalists like firecrackers, but Chris maintained his composure, drawing from years of experience handling the press. He answered each one with clarity and conviction, emphasizing his commitment to this new chapter in his life. His shoulders felt lighter with each response, as if he were shedding the burden of expectations he'd carried for so long. Later that afternoon, Chris drove to Olivia's house, his heart beating faster as he approached the familiar doorway. The garden she'd always loved was in full bloom, filling the air with sweet fragrance. Elijah opened the door before he could knock, practically bouncing with excitement, his sneakers squeaking against the hardwood floor. "Is it true, Dad? You're really leaving your company?" Elijah's blue eyes sparkled with hope, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his t-shirt. Chris ruffled his son's hair, savoring the simple gesture of affection. "That's right, buddy. I want to spend more time with you." The words felt right, natural, like they should have been said years ago. Olivia stood in the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. Her expression was guarded as she studied Chris, though he could see the questions swimming in her eyes. "Are you really ready to walk away from everything?" she asked, her tone careful and measured, like someone testing thin ice. "Nothing means more to me than you and Elijah," Chris replied, meeting her gaze with unwavering sincerity. "I'm ready to prove it." He hoped she could hear the truth in his voice, see the commitment in his eyes. Over the next few days, Chris immersed himself in the transition process, determined to do things right. He spent long hours with his executive team, ensuring every detail was properly handled, every loose end tied up neat and tight. But unlike before, he made sure to leave the office by 3 each afternoon to pick up Elijah from school, trading boardroom meetings for playground conversations. At the local science fair, Chris helped Elijah set up his project about renewable energy, carefully arranging the solar panels and wind turbine models. He beamed with pride as his son confidently explained the concept to the judges, using terms that would have confused most adults. The passion in Elijah's voice reminded Chris so much of Olivia's own determination. "That's my boy," Chris whispered to himself, catching Olivia's eye across the crowded gymnasium. She quickly looked away, but not before he noticed the slight softening in her expression, like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. Chris made sure to include Olivia in their activities, suggesting family dinners and weekend outings to the park or museum. Though she often hesitated, weighing each invitation carefully, she rarely declined, watching their interactions with cautious interest. Each shared moment felt like a small step toward healing. One evening, as Chris and Elijah sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully assembling a model rocket amid scattered instructions and tiny parts, Olivia paused in the doorway. A faint smile played on her lips as she watched them work, though her eyes still held a hint of uncertainty. The warm lamplight cast a gentle glow over the scene, making it feel intimate and precious. "Can you hold this part steady, Dad?" Elijah asked, his tongue sticking out slightly as he concentrated on applying glue to a delicate piece of the rocket's fin. "Got it, son," Chris replied, his hands gentle but firm as they worked together, the simple task feeling more meaningful than any business deal he'd ever closed. From her spot in the doorway, Olivia observed their easy interaction, her expression a complex mixture of hope and hesitation. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself, as if protecting her heart while it slowly learned to trust again. The warm afternoon sun bathed the park in golden light as Chris and Elijah tossed a baseball back and forth. Elijah's laughter echoed across the grass as Chris pretended to fumble a catch, making exaggerated faces that sent his son into fits of giggles. The bond between them was growing stronger with each passing day, evident in the way Elijah's eyes lit up whenever his father praised his throwing technique. Olivia sat on a nearby bench, watching them with a mixture of caution and contentment. Her journalist instincts kept her wary, but she couldn't deny the joy on her son's face. Her phone buzzed, and she saw her friend Sarah's name flash on the screen. "Olivia, turn on the news right now," Sarah's voice was urgent. "Marcus Chen, Chris's old business partner. He's gone to the press with some pretty nasty stuff about Chris leaving you and Elijah. It's all over social media already." Olivia's heart sank as she quickly pulled up a news site on her phone, her fingers trembling slightly. The headline screamed accusations about Chris's character, painting him as a calculating businessman who had abandoned his family for the sake of his image and success. Each word felt like a personal attack, reopening old wounds she thought had begun to heal. Within hours, reporters descended upon Olivia's quiet neighborhood like vultures circling their prey. Camera flashes lit up the evening like lightning bugs as journalists called out questions through her front gate, their voices growing more insistent with each passing minute. Inside, Olivia paced the living room, her anger building with each passing moment, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she snapped at Chris, who stood by the window with his shoulders slumped, looking years older than he had that morning. "You said you'd protect us, and now look at this circus. They're turning our lives into entertainment." Chris ran his hands through his hair, his face etched with worry and exhaustion. "I'll fix this, Olivia. I promise. I won't let them hurt our family again." But the media storm only intensified, growing more vicious with each passing day. Despite the paternity test results being public record, tabloids began questioning Elijah's legitimacy again, spinning wild theories about cover-ups and conspiracies. At school, Elijah faced a barrage of questions from classmates who had seen their parents reading the sensational headlines, their innocent curiosity cutting deeper than any reporter's questions. "Mom, why are they saying those mean things about Dad?" Elijah asked one evening, his voice small and confused, clutching his favorite stuffed animal close to his chest. Chris immediately contacted his legal team, determination setting his jaw as he instructed them to file a lawsuit against Marcus Chen. But the damage was already spreading like wildfire across social media and news outlets, with new accusations appearing hourly. "I thought things would be different this time," Olivia said quietly one evening as she drew the curtains against the photographers outside, her hands lingering on the fabric. "But here we are again, hiding from the world because of your past. It feels like we're right back where we started." Chris stood in her living room, his heart heavy as he watched her turn away from him, the distance between them feeling like an ocean. "Olivia, please. This isn't like before. I'm not running away this time. I'll stand and fight for us." "Maybe not," she replied, her voice tight with emotion, wrapping her arms around herself protectively. "But your world is still causing chaos in ours, and I don't know how much more of this Elijah can take." Outside, camera flashes continued to illuminate the darkening sky like persistent fireflies, as Chris watched helplessly, knowing that every step forward they had taken now felt like it was crumbling beneath their feet. The weight of his past mistakes pressed down on him, threatening to destroy the fragile foundation of trust they had begun to rebuild. Chris stood at the podium, his hands gripping its edges until his knuckles whitened as cameras flashed before him. The room buzzed with anticipation as reporters leaned forward, their recorders raised like a forest of electronic arms. He took a deep breath, his eyes finding the lens of the main camera while sweat dampened the collar of his crisp white shirt. "I've called this press conference to address the recent allegations about my past," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart and the slight tremor in his hands. "But more importantly, I'm here to speak directly to two people who mean everything to me." In her living room, Olivia sat on the edge of her couch watching the broadcast with her coffee growing cold beside her. Elijah was at school, protected by the new security team Chris had hired, professional men and women who blended seamlessly into the background. Her fingers twisted nervously in her lap as she listened, her journalist's mind picking up every nuance of his delivery. Years ago, I made choices that hurt the people I loved most, Chris continued, his voice cracking slightly as emotion threatened to overwhelm him. I've spent years running from those mistakes, but today, I'm facing them head-on. To my son, Elijah, I'm sorry I wasn't there for your early years. To Olivia, he paused, emotion clear in his eyes as he swallowed hard. I'm sorry I let fear and pride drive me away from the best thing that ever happened to me. You deserved better. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as she watched Chris bare his soul to the world, her own eyes growing misty. This wasn't the polished businessman she'd known. This was raw and real, his usual armor stripped away to reveal the man underneath. These recent allegations aren't just an attack on me, Chris said firmly, squaring his shoulders. They're an attempt to hurt my family, and I won't stand for it. My legal team is taking action against those responsible. But more importantly, I want to make something clear. I'm not the man I was back then. The choices I made don't define who I am today, or who I want to be for my son and the woman I still love. Over the next few days, Chris's actions matched his words like steady footsteps following a map. His legal team moved swiftly against his former partner, filing a comprehensive lawsuit that left no stone unturned. He arranged for additional security at Elijah's school, ensuring his son could continue his education without disruption, personally vetting each guard himself. Private cars with trained drivers transported them safely when needed, their routes carefully planned and monitored. Through it all, Chris remained a constant presence like a lighthouse in a storm. His messages arrived daily, not grand gestures, but simple words of support and encouragement that showed his commitment. Thinking of you both, one text read. Let me know if you need anything. Another time, he sent a photo of himself at his lawyer's office with the caption, fighting for what matters most. Each small act of consistency chipped away at Olivia's walls, like gentle waves wearing down stone. She watched as he handled the media circus with grace, deflecting attention away from her and Elijah while taking full responsibility for his past actions. When reporters tried to ambush her outside her workplace, Chris's security team was there before she could even call for help, a shield of quiet professionalism. Late one evening, after another long day of managing the crisis, Chris knocked on Olivia's front door. She opened it slowly, noting the tired lines around his eyes and the determination in his stance. His tie was loosened and his jacket was creased from hours of wear. I'm not going anywhere this time, he said simply, his voice firm with conviction, eyes never leaving hers. Olivia's hands trembled as she pulled the wrinkled paper from Elijah's backpack. The school assignment caught her eye immediately. The family I dream of, written in Elijah's careful handwriting at the top of the page. Her heart skipped a beat as she began to read. My dream family isn't like other families, Elijah had written. It's the one I already have, just together instead of apart. My mom is the strongest person I know. She makes me feel safe and loved every day. My dad tries really hard to make up for lost time. When we're all together, everything feels right. Tears spilled onto Olivia's cheeks as she continued reading. Elijah described simple scenes, family dinners, weekend outings, holidays spent together. The innocent longing in his words pierced her heart. Sometimes I pretend we all live in the same house, the essay continued. Dad would help me with science projects while Mom makes her famous cookies. We'd watch movies together and laugh at the funny parts. No more going back and forth or saying goodbye all the time. Olivia sat heavily on the couch, overwhelmed by her son's raw honesty. She pulled out her phone with shaking fingers and called Chris. Can you come over? She asked quietly. There's something you need to see. When Chris arrived, Olivia wordlessly handed him the essay. She watched his face as he read, noting how his eyes grew glassy and his jaw tightened with emotion. I had no idea he felt this strongly, Chris said, his voice rough. He looked up at Olivia, his eyes filled with regret and hope. We've been so focused on our own feelings, we didn't see how deeply this was affecting him. They called Elijah into the living room. He froze when he saw his essay in Chris's hands, his eyes darting nervously between his parents. "We read your essay, sweetheart," Olivia said gently. "Can we talk about it?" Elijah nodded slowly, sitting between them on the couch. "Are you mad?" "No, honey," Olivia assured him, pulling him close. "We just want to understand how you're feeling." "Your words were beautiful," Chris added, placing a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "And honest. That's important." "I just want us to be happy," Elijah whispered, his voice small but clear. "Like we are when we're together, but all the time." Chris and Olivia exchanged a look over their son's head, years of hurt and hope passing between them in that single glance. "We want you to be happy too," Olivia said carefully. "And we're trying to figure things out, even if it's complicated sometimes." "Can we at least try?" Elijah asked, looking up at them with eyes that held so much hope. "To be a real family?" "We are a real family," Chris assured him. "Just different from what we expected. But we both love you more than anything." Elijah wrapped his arms around both his parents, pulling them close. "I just want us to be happy," he whispered into their embrace. The moonlight cast silver ripples across the lake's surface as Chris and Olivia walked along its peaceful shore. The gentle lapping of water against the rocks created a soothing rhythm, matching their slow footsteps. Pine needles crunched softly beneath their feet, releasing their fresh scent into the cool night air. Chris had chosen this secluded spot carefully, away from the pressures of their public life and the constant scrutiny they'd faced. Olivia wrapped her arms around herself, taking in the serenity of the moment. A light breeze stirred her hair, carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers from the nearby meadow. The cabin getaway had surprised her, but something about the simplicity of this place had helped her lower her guard. Here, they weren't the subjects of tabloid headlines or public speculation. They were just Chris and Olivia, as they had been years ago, before fame and fortune had complicated everything. "Remember our first vacation together?" Chris asked softly, his voice carrying across the still night air. "That little beach house in Maine?" His eyes crinkled at the corners, the way they always did when he recalled happy memories. Olivia smiled despite herself, warmth spreading through her chest at the memory. "You burned the pancakes every morning." She remembered how he'd stubbornly refused to give up trying, determined to master at least one breakfast dish. "But you ate them anyway," Chris chuckled, then grew serious. His steps slowed until they both stood still, facing the moonlit water. The surface sparkled like scattered diamonds beneath the stars. "Olivia, I've spent every day since I left wishing I had chosen differently. The success, the money, the influence, none of it meant anything without you and Elijah." Olivia's breath caught in her throat as Chris turned to face her, his eyes reflecting both vulnerability and determination. The moonlight softened his features, reminding her of the younger man she'd first fallen in love with. "I know I hurt you," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. "And I know saying sorry isn't enough, but I love you, Olivia. I never stopped loving you." Olivia felt tears welling in her eyes. The walls she'd built around her heart began to crumble, but fear still held her back. "Chris, She hesitated, struggling to find the words. Her heart raced in her chest. "I still love you too, but I'm scared. What if something happens again? What if the pressure becomes too much?" Chris reached for her hands, holding them gently in his own. His touch was warm and familiar, sending tingles up her arms. "I understand your fear. I do." Then, to Olivia's surprise, he lowered himself to one knee. The moonlight caught the sparkle of a simple but elegant ring in his hand, its diamond catching the starlight. "This isn't just a proposal," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "It's a promise to be the man you and Elijah deserve. To choose you both, every single day, no matter what comes our way. To prove through actions, not just words, that you can trust me again." Tears rolled down Olivia's cheeks as she looked at the man before her. Not the powerful businessman the world knew, but the Chris she had fallen in love with years ago. The man who had shown up consistently for their son, who had faced his mistakes head on, who had chosen their family over his empire. His eyes held nothing but pure love and devotion. Through her tears, Olivia nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "But let's take it one step at a time." A shooting star streaked across the sky above them, as if nature itself was blessing their new beginning. The morning sun filtered through stained glass windows as soft violin music filled the small chapel, casting rainbow-colored patterns across the wooden pews. Unlike their first wedding, with its excessive grandeur and hundreds of guests, this ceremony was beautifully intimate, with only their closest friends and family present, barely 30 people in total. The simple decorations of white roses and eucalyptus, coupled with the warm atmosphere, reflected the genuine nature of their renewed commitment. Olivia stood in a side room, adjusting her cream-colored dress with its delicate lace overlay. Her hands trembled slightly as Elijah, dressed in a sharp navy suit with a boutonniere that matched the chapel flowers, approached her with a bright smile that lit up his whole face. "You look beautiful, Mom," he said, his blue eyes sparkling with joy and unshed tears. "Like a princess, but better." Olivia pulled him close, fighting back tears that threatened to ruin her carefully applied makeup. "Thank you, sweetheart. Are you ready for this big moment?" Elijah nodded, offering his arm with a proud grin that reminded her so much of Chris. As the music changed to the familiar wedding march, they stepped toward the heavy chapel doors. The guests rose in unison, but Olivia barely noticed them. Her eyes locked with Chris's at the altar, seeing only love and certainty in his gaze as he stood there, looking handsome and nervous in his charcoal gray suit. Walking down the aisle with Elijah by her side felt worlds different from her first wedding. This time, there was no pressure from society photographers, no scrutiny from business associates, just pure love and the strength of their family bond shining through every step. Chris's voice shook slightly as he delivered his vows, his fingers tightly gripping hers. "Olivia, you gave me a second chance I didn't deserve. You and Elijah are my whole world, and I promise to spend every day showing you both how much you mean to me. I've learned what truly matters, and it's not success or status. It's the love we share." Olivia's response was equally heartfelt, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "Chris, through all our struggles, our love never truly died. With Elijah's help, we found our way back to each other. I promise to trust in our love and face whatever comes next together, as partners and equals." After exchanging rings, simple bands that meant so much more than the elaborate ones from their first wedding, they turned to include Elijah in their first embrace as a reunited family. There wasn't a dry eye in the chapel, and several quiet sniffles echoed through the sacred space. Later that week, they moved into their new home, a comfortable house with a large backyard filled with mature oak trees, perfect for family gatherings and summer barbecues. As they unpacked boxes and organized chaos, Elijah proudly showed them the latest issue of Teen Voice magazine, featuring his essay, "The Family I Dream Of," which had won first place in a national writing contest. They gathered in the living room, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and takeout containers, as Elijah read his words aloud. "Sometimes dreams take time to come true. My dream was simple. I wanted my mom and dad together, happy and whole. Through patience, love, and forgiveness, my dream became real. Now I know that families can heal, love can return, and second chances are possible when you believe." Chris wrapped his arm around Olivia's waist as they listened to their son's words, pride and love evident in his expression. Olivia leaned into his embrace, finally feeling complete in a way she hadn't in years. The sound of Elijah's voice, filled with hope and joy, echoed through their new home, marking the beginning of their fresh start together as a family united by love and second chances. If you enjoyed the story of Olivia, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.